Right. So the story of pluralism really begins with the work of David Truman and Robert Dahl. Truman's pluralism viewed interest groups as a kind of natural element of democracy. And so for Truman, organised interests came about when a policy issue becomes particularly salient. And the salience of this issue is really what motivates other actors to join the group to address it. And so in Truman's view, organised interests really are a mere reflection of the distribution of salient interests in society. And so he observed that the formation of associations really tend to occur in waves, because once one group organises to reassert some kind of satisfactory equilibrium, it might inspire counter-organisation amongst rival groups in a kind of dialectical process. So we kind of see this salience of policy issues as being the motivating force for organisation. Now, Dahl's pluralism wasn't really first and foremost a theory of interest groups, but really a more overarching theory of power. And I'm sure that you've come across Dahl's ideas of democracy before. But as part of Dahl's picture of power, he showed in the book Who Governs that in the pluralist process, citizens could readily mobilise into interest groups. And like Truman, he saw interest groups as having the potential to wield power over policy. It might just be worth mentioning that kind of while Truman and Dahl are really the sort of kingpins of the pluralist idea, they really differed in the amount of weight that they attached to interest groups in the policy-making process. So for Truman, policy was mostly determined by the balance of power among groups. And for Dahl, groups play only part of the role alongside other political actors like politicians, parties and the like. But they both see this influence as pretty benign, and this is the important bit. So while they attach different weights, they both see them as important players, but really this influence is seen as benign in the pluralist view. And this is because the groups were really seen as information providers in the process of making visible a policy stance that really reflected the interests of ordinary citizens. And so in this view, policymakers are highly sensitive to the preferences of people. And so an important element of the story here is also an emphasis on the role of competitive elections. So we're seeing policymakers as responsive to citizen preferences. And here interest groups are really just a reflection of that, or sort of an amplification as a kind of information mechanism towards informing policymakers of citizen and constituent preferences. And so I just want to be explicit about this, and then we can map it onto the three-stage influence production process. And we have that here. So if we sort of look at the three stages of the influence production process, the first stage is how groups form and mobilise. So how do interest groups form and mobilise in the pluralism, so under pluralism approach? Well, because a certain issue becomes salient, so really what motivates mobilisation is issue salience. There's something up with the policy environment. So Truman will call this a disturbance in the policy making environment. And so enough people think that there's something wrong with a policy that it becomes salient. They think it needs to be addressed, and so they organise and mobilise around it. And so what type of influence tactics do groups use? Well, under pluralism, groups are providing information on the issue to policymakers. So really they are information providers, provide information. This is how they aim to influence. They want to provide information on the issue to policymakers and really assist them in understanding the interests of their constituents. And so they're exercising their influence through the electoral process. Again, we're kind of talking about a benign form of influence in the pluralist view. Policy outcomes, the extent to which they reflect or fail to reflect the influencing efforts of these groups. Well, the extent to which policy outcomes do reflect these influence efforts is really according to the weighted salience of the issue. So again, we're kind of saying that within the sort of electoral process, certain issues are going to become salient, certain groups are going to mobilise around the salience of those issues. This is going to be reflective of the general interests of constituents, and so policy outcomes are going to be representing or reflective of the weighted salience of these issues. All very nice. So the result on policy outcomes, well, the kind of resulting policy outcomes reflect the will of the people, so to speak. And so the formation and day-to-day operations of organised interest really support rather than undermine democratic government. This is the pluralist view. And so I want you to give yourself a minute to just think about these conclusions. And they might seem a bit counterintuitive in not only the political economy that we have today, but also in light of some of the things that you talked about last week. But at what point do you think that this idea breaks down? Perhaps pause the video for a minute or two and think this through. Right, so I'm sure there are aspects of lecture from last week that might have factored into your thoughts there, and I imagine that you might also have considered one of the biggest criticisms of the pluralist view in that it really treats all of us as equally free and able to organise into groups according to our interests. But do all of us really have an equal capacity to organise? I think it's safe to say that we do not. And so it's likely, of course, that we'll differ in both our ability and willingness to contribute to groups, even if they share our interests. And so it's pretty unlikely that a plurality of interests will ultimately be represented in the policy-making mix. And this is where really the insights from last week fit into the picture. So if you recall Olson's logic from last week, what it tells us sort of really at the end of it all is that the few defeat the many. And so Dahl and Truman's pluralism doesn't really exist in Olson's view. Instead, we sort of see that kind of separate coalitions based on groups with special interests separately dominate their own different areas of public policy. So we're not saying that it's kind of one overarching group of people that dominate everything, but we might see that kind of business interests in their own specific domain are the ones who come up and rule in that particular policy domain. So, for example, you might have certain manufacturers in a manufacturing space, but also, we're seeing quite recently the sort of the power of the fishermen. And so we see that these kind of multiple elites are ruling in each of their own policy areas. Now, we can map these ideas onto our influence production process as well. And again, I'm doing this to sort of really highlight where these different approaches differ and how they differ in each stage of this influence production process. So if we kind of categorize these theories, the theories that you will have counted last week as, I'm going to say, multiple elitism, we kind of see that there is some type of exchange happening between the interest groups, their members, and public officials. And so how do interest groups form and mobilise in this view? Well, because of Olson's logic of collective action, we know that the interest system will be biased towards small groups with significant stakes in policy. And in order for groups to form and mobilise in the first place, members must get some kind of benefit, so some kind of exchange between groups and their members. But these exchanges need not be just material. It could also be a sort of expressive exchange or an expressive benefit or a solidary one as well. But nevertheless, there is some sort of exchange mechanism that must underpin organisation. So some kind of exchange mechanism. Different, of course, from sort of this natural development of mobilised interest coming from the salience of issues. So what type of influence tactics do groups use under this sort of multiple elitism view of things? Well, groups, again, thinking about this kind of exchange idea, they can exchange political support. Or the resources that can be translated into political support. And they sort of exercise their influence both directly through lobbying and indirectly through party financing. So multiple exchange theories also sort of tend to assume that this influence is going to end up in policy outcomes. There's no real sort of question about the degree to which it will show up or won't show up, whether there is success or failure in the sort of influence showing up in policy. Multiple elite sort of exchange theories tend to assume that the policy outcomes do reflect these influence efforts, and that policy is really inevitably captured by the interests that do not reflect those of wider society. So again, we've kind of got a big difference, a big normative difference between pluralism and multiple elitism when it comes to policy outcomes. And now, of course, sort of the evidence on actual influence is pretty mixed, but I'll try to pick up a little bit on sort of how we go about measuring influence a bit later. But this, of course, as I said, sort of takes us a very long way from the kind of pluralist heaven when we're thinking about the effects on democracy. So far from being essential to kind of a working democracy, what we're seeing in this sort of multiple elitism picture of things is that these organised interests are really viewed as a kind of pervasive threat to democracy, as opposed to being facilitative of it. Now, Olson's logic seems pretty intuitive, but more recent evidence suggests that the collective action problem, really at the core of the logic, doesn't really seem to be as severe as Olson predicted. And even when it does show up, solutions to it aren't really as rare as Olson would have it either. We kind of see in reality that many different types of organisations enter lobbying communities, and these reflect a broad set of interests. Some of the benefits from organisation are specific, but many are pretty diffuse. Many interest organisations have members, but most of them nowadays do not. So many of them are really sort of institutions, if you like. And there isn't too much scope in the exchange view of special interests for these types of interest organisations to exist, which again, kind of thinking about what is the state of the kind of lobbying community or the organised interest community right now? Well, the majority of organised interest groups that are on the lobbying circuit are less membership organisations, more institutions. And so in recognition of this sort of heterogeneity, more recent perspectives in political science really go back to Truman and Dahl's assessment of the interest system as being plural. But these recent perspectives really differ quite sharply in recognising that mobilisation into organised groups isn't automatic, and it's definitely not easy. And the groups that do organise are not really likely to reflect the distribution of interest in society, nowhere near as perfectly as traditional pluralism would have it. And so I'm following the literature in classifying these new approaches as neo-pluralist. So how does the neo-pluralist approach set out the three dimensions of the influence production process? Well, the neo-pluralist view says that it all depends. And what does it depend on? Context. And adding context to the mix, of course, always complicates things. And this is probably starting to sound like a bit of a catchphrase of mine, but let's work this through. So we're now thinking about the neo-pluralist approach. How do SIGs form and mobilise in the neo-pluralist account? Well, we're kind of starting in similar territory to the pluralist account and think, well, generally it's when policy problems develop that are a concern to latent interest organisations. And so, interests that could be mobilised. And so when we see that policy problems arise, uncertainty over the policy increases, which then mobilises large numbers of policy opponents. So we do have a policy problem dimension to mobilisation, but it depends. Whether organised interests will mobilise, will form, is going to depend on the organised interest context. So mobilisation doesn't happen in isolation from the organised interest context. And what does the organised interest context mean? Well, it means who is out there already, which interests have already organised, which interests could potentially organise. So we're sort of seeing mobilisation on one policy problem, not in isolation, but in a broader context of the sort of already mobilised, if you like. And I'll talk a little bit more about competition between interests in the next video. But yes, we have policy problems as motivating mobilisation, but not in abstract from the organised interest context. So who else is mobilised? Who else could potentially be mobilised? What type of influence tactics do groups use in the neo-pluralist account? Well, again, this really all depends. And so there are going to be lots of options open in terms of tactics. We can think about political support, again, lobbying, and both sort of inside lobbying. So this is where we have lobbying of policymakers and legislators, but we also have outside lobbying. So this is lobbying of the media and the public. Now, we might also have to make decisions on whether we lobby friends and allies or whether we lobby opponents to try and change votes. And while all of these options are sort of on the table in the neo-pluralist account, the important part is that the choice of tactic really depends on who the lobbyist is, what is the interest, and what are the preferences of whoever is on the receiving end of the lobbying effort. So essentially what this is saying is that not all tactics, not tic-tacs, not all tactics are available to all organised interests all of the time. So really it's going to depend on the interest itself, the organisation representing it, so kind of the capacity of the organisation, what kind of constraints do they face in picking out different types of tactics, who are they associated with, what is the interest, is it a public interest type interest, is it a business interest? This is going to dictate to some extent the type of tactic that the special interest group uses, and also the preferences. I'm going to put lobbyee, but you know what I mean. Basically the person on the receiving end of the lobbying effort. And so these three things are really going to influence who is lobbied and how. So it's dependent. We've got this idea of dependency again. It's not so simple as saying they provide information, not so simple as sort of being exchangey, extractive, transactional. It's really going to depend on the specificities of the people involved, the interest involved, and the organisation involved. Policy outcomes. Are policy outcomes going to reflect or fail to reflect the influence efforts of the neo-pluralist perspective? Well, the neo-pluralist approach is really stressing that it's really kind of this complexity of all the interactions between these actors and within the organised interest groups, as well as their interactions with the folks they lobby as allies or opponents. And it's this complexity that really determines the likelihood that an interest group really secures its objective. So again, we're kind of saying that this is contingent, and the kind of complexity of interactions is going to determine what actually happens in terms of policy outcomes. And so the influence process is really conditioned in important ways, both by policymakers' preferences and those of the electorate. But interest groups or interest organisations are also constrained in what they can do, both by their own structure and also by the lobbying community as a whole. So we're kind of adding these things together and thinking about how they really lead to determine policy outcomes. Now, whether policy outcomes really reflect the influence efforts of organised interest groups in the neo-pluralist view depends on the context. And this is really different from the exchange view because not all actors with a capacity to engage in exchanges will do so with any certainty and definitely without any certainty of success. But it's also different from the pluralist view because organised interests aren't perfectly constrained by democratic politics, so to speak. And so it also differs in another super important way from these two early approaches in the ways the different stages relate to each other. Now, I hinted a little bit just then about the kind of the direction of travel and how these things are interacting. But in the pluralist view and multiple elite view, these things are all pretty separate. The direction of travel is unidirectional, but we can kind of see the different stages as pretty separate. And so the early approaches tended to see the production process in what I tend to call the sausage factory terms, where you stick the ingredients in, the machine mixes them all up, and then out pops a perfectly shaped sausage that kind of looks exactly as you expected it to. As I said, each stage in the process is quite separate, and the direction of travel from one stage to the next is unidirectional, from ingredients through processing to the final product. But the neo-pluralist approach recognises that there are linkages between these stages of production, and they move both forwards and backwards. So these linkages are not just unidirectional, they're actually multidirectional. And none of these three stages in the influence production process can really be seen as discrete in the neo-pluralist view. So instead, they kind of both determine and are determined by one another. So we're kind of saying, to what extent is the policy problem solely determining mobilisation? Are there any links between the policy problem and some of these later stages? Is that linkage just forward, or is there actually a linkage that might go backwards? And likewise, I've already just sort of said that the kind of policy outcomes, the end of the process is really contingent on the complexity of the interactions at this stage. And I want you to think about these linkages a little bit more in the task below.